For Mrs. Thatcher sensed early on that the political mood in the industrial and mining heartlands was shifting. For her, council estates were never political no-go areas. Rather, her instincts led her to woo and shape policies for just those people who her Tory predecessors scarcely knew how to address.
She has exploited, if that's the right word, the natural conservatism of most people in Britain. The average chap in the factory or the pub has really held conservative views for very many years, but he didn't used to vote Conservative, and he didn't used to identify at all with the Conservative Party. In a curious way, she has managed to liberate that conservatism of his into a voting pattern.
And the actual policies have matched the social instinct. It was Sir Keith Joseph who pointed the party in a new direction. Reject the middle ground, he said. It's constantly shifting to the left. Go for the common ground instead.
Events are our allies in dragging socialists to the common ground of reality. Common ground. That's the real meaning of the word consensus. Common ground. Policies consistent with the reality and yet with the beliefs that we and others have come to hold.
Sir Keith was the forerunner, the theoretician, the pathfinder. But if the socialist ratchet was ever to be reversed, then all sorts of policies deemed impossible by Tories in the past would have to be carried out. Mrs. Thatcher was Sir Keith's most adept pupil, with the priceless gift of turning theory into practical politics.
I don't know yet. I mean, what brings you here? The boss. The boss.
One price of altering the terms of the political debate has been to lose much of her original cabinet.
The people I've got coming have no particular great significance, all those who are not here. They're the ones who are in London this weekend.
When she formed it in 1979, it was greeted dismissively as the mixtures before. Since then, Mrs. Thatcher has transformed it into a group after her own mind. As a result, her critics say, the backbenches contain a whole alternative cabinet, more able than the real one. Of the 25 members of the first Thatcher team, almost half have gone. A few jumped, most were pushed. Howell, Stevens, Atkins, Knott, Carlyle, Maud, Pryor, Pym, Carrington, Soames, Gilmore. The tales they told out of school, added to her own wish to have a government that doesn't waste time wrangling, have created a popular myth of a cabinet of gutless yes-men.
I think what perhaps is missing is not so much the argument as the more discursive side of things, the discussion and analysis. That probably takes second place to the exhilaration of having a good argument and getting everything going at top pitch.
Mrs. Thatcher's robust manner towards the totally male cabinet over which she presides may spring from her belief that men get stuck in pernickety detail. Her instinct, she says, is to cut the cackle and be practical. No one pretends life in the cabinet is easy.
Well, she has a sort of chilly contempt for all her colleagues in the cabinet, and that, I think, is mainly responsible for this brassy self-confidence which she has. She feels she knows everything, understands everything better than anybody else, and just will not take advice or listen to anybody.
It's no comfort to the young unemployed of Grantham or anywhere else that the town's most celebrated daughter has conquered the party in the cabinet and changed the political face of the nation. For them, for the 3 to 4 million unemployed, and ultimately for Mrs. Thatcher herself, what matters is that 10 years on, her constant vision of a soundly based prosperity remains just that, still a vision. Her opponents believe it's fatally flawed.
Her greatest single error, probably, has been to reject the concept of social consensus in principle, because if you look around the world today, the countries which are doing very much better than Britain in every field are those which are based basically on a consensus between government and both sides of industry, like Japan, the Scandinavian countries, Germany, which have kept high employment right through 2 recessions. And I think that in the end this will be her downfall.
Critics inside the party doubt if Mrs. Thatcher's austere doctrine of self-help can help the new long-term jobless. As she told businessmen, "The only thing I'm going to do for you is to make you freer to do things yourselves. If you can't do it then, I'm sorry." These young Oxford University Conservatives have every reason to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Mrs. Thatcher's leadership. She's an Oxford Tory herself. Most recent Conservative Prime Ministers have come from here. Perhaps one of these very faces is a Conservative Prime Minister to be. After 10 years, Mrs. Thatcher should be taken at her word. If people won't take the freedom they're offered, no one can help them. If the revolution fails to deliver the goods, it's not the revolution that's wrong. It's the people that have been a disappointment.
To Margaret Thatcher, energy was a political problem. In the early 70s, the oil crisis had plunged the world into recession, and the miners had brought down Ted Heath's Conservative government. Mrs. Thatcher was determined the same would not happen to her. She set out to break their power.
What we have seen in this country is the emergence of an organised revolutionary minority who are prepared to exploit industrial disputes, but whose real aim is the breakdown of law and order and the destruction of democratic parliamentary government.
The politicisation of this subject started with Margaret Thatcher.
She was very concerned always, I remember when I was Secretary of State for Energy, to promote nuclear power. Long before the issue of climate change came up, because she was concerned about energy security, and she didn't trust the Middle East, and she didn't trust the National Union of Mine Workers. So she didn't trust oil, and she didn't trust coal. So therefore she felt we really had to push ahead with nuclear power. And then when the climate change, global warming thing came up, she felt, well, this is great. This is another argument, because it doesn't have any carbon dioxide emissions. This is another argument why you should go for nuclear. And that is what she was really largely saying. It's been misrepresented since then.
And so she said to the scientists, she went to the Royal Society and she said, there's money on the table for you to prove this stuff. So, of course, they went away and did that.
Inevitably, the moment politicians put their weight behind something and attach their name to it in some ways, of course, money will flow. That's the way it goes. And inevitably, research, development, institutions started to bubble up, if I can put it that way, which were going to be researching climate, but with a particular emphasis on the relationship between carbon dioxide and temperature.
At the request of Mrs. Thatcher, the UK Met Office set up a climate modelling unit which provided the basis for a new international committee called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC.
They came out with the first big report which predicted climatic disaster as a result of global warming. I remember going to the scientific press conference and being amazed by two things. First, the simplicity and eloquence of the message and the vigour with which it was delivered. And secondly, the total disregard of all climate science up till that time, including, incidentally, the role of the sun, which had been the subject of a major meeting at the Royal Society just a few months earlier.
But the new emphasis on man-made carbon dioxide as a possible environmental problem didn't just appeal to Mrs. Thatcher.
It was certainly something very favourable to the environmental idea, what I call the medieval environmentalism of let's get back to the way things were in medieval times and get rid of all these dreadful cars and machines. They loved it because carbon dioxide was for them an emblem of industrialization.